Okay, maybe we'll get started if everybody's ready. Can everybody hear me? I guess so, right? So welcome everybody to our panel discussion of the film The Nightcrawlers, which of course addresses the war on drugs and extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. My name is Kjell Anderson. I'm the director of the Master of Human Rights program at the University of Manitoba. So we're fortunate to be joined today by two individuals who are real experts on the things we're talking about, the real experts on the things that are addressed in the film. So welcome both of you. First of all, we have Raffy Lerma, who's a multi-award-winning Filipino photojournalist, who of course is also depicted in the film. I'm sure had a big role in the film. And thank you, Raffy. Thanks for staying up as well. I know it's very late there in Manila, so we appreciate it. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Great. And we're also joined by Richard Lyons, who's an associate professor of human rights and criminology at Swansea University, and also the former executive director for quite a few years of Harm Reduction International. So obviously one of the leading experts, I would say, on human rights and drug policy. So
Hi, Kjell.
Hi, Rick. Can I call you Rick or are you Richard?
Hi, Raffy.
Hi,
Yeah,
Rick.
Rick.
Hi,
Yeah. Hi, Raffy.
I knew you as Rick before, but So I'm going to begin by just posing a couple of questions of my own, and then I hope that people in the audience will ask their own questions, and I'll jump in if there aren't any questions from the audience. But just make a comment, and I'll keep an eye on that as we go along. So actually, maybe I'll start with you, Rick, just because you're relatively fresh to the film. I'm sure you've seen it many times, Raffy. But Rick, what's your initial impression of the film, or what's your impression of the film?
I mean, leaving aside just what a powerful and emotive film it is, and the tragedy and the bravery and the incredible work that Raffy and his colleagues have done. I mean, what strikes me most of all is it's not a film about drugs, right? And when you look at the use of drug laws as a tool of social control, it's never really about drugs. The drugs become a rationale for the government to attack or control populations that they think are marginalized or disposable. And you could see that in the film there about these killings are not happening in wealthy parts of Manila. These killings are happening in people who are already marginalized and living in terrible conditions, impoverished conditions. And drug laws and fighting drugs becomes a very convenient rationale to target people and to build a social consensus that somehow there needs to be massive violence done and to justify that violence. But the drugs are clearly an ideological rationale for that, and so that's what really struck me, is that the people who are being targeted are people that are already victimized in many ways and marginalized, and the drug war becomes a tool to take that violence even further and legitimize it.
That's interesting, and maybe just picking from up from that, Raffy, is Duterte popular? And if he's popular, why is he so popular? And how does this war on drugs issue play into that?
Well, when he came, when he campaigned for the president, he was a bit, well, what do you call it? He was different, basically. He was different from what we call traditional politicians. And in my lifetime, I've never seen someone like Duterte running for a position as high as the president. He was a Davao mayor for several years. I mean, their family ruled Davao, and basically what he's done nationwide, he's done it in Davao, and it was accepted. It was accepted for many years, and he just used this kind of policy or campaign and unleashed it nationwide. And I guess people were also hoping for change. People were also there are many factors. I think so. One is also distrust with the justice system. And it's many factors of that, and they were tired of the justice system serving only the rich, and maybe that's what they were thinking. People in the Philippines were thinking this is the quick way of doing things, and so they supported it. They knew, like myself, I didn't know much about how to solve the drug issue or before, and when he came in, majority of Filipinos supported him. They wanted to get rid of drugs. But later on, we found out that this whole campaign was instilling fear, like what Rick said, and it's really control.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I know Duterte even claims to have killed people himself when he was mayor of Davao, which is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
And Rick, can I ask you if this is, just looking at the big picture, is this kind of treatment of drug offenders, or alleged drug offenders, I should say, is it typical, or is it especially brutal what we see in the Philippines?
Well, I mean, what's happening in the Philippines is obviously the extreme end of the brutality. But I mean, when I talk about drug policy, I always emphasize the fact that, we can't point fingers at the Philippines or point fingers at Indonesia or Iran, countries that have very harsh drug policies, because what those policies are simply kind of the logical extension of how drug laws are crafted. Drug laws and drug suppression is based and premised on the idea that if we punish people, people will stop taking drugs. If we punish people, people will stop selling drugs. And the kind of punishments that get enacted take different forms based upon the legal and social traditions of different countries. If we look in Canada, for example, those might be, denying welfare payments, denying social housing to people with drug offenses. It might be taking children away from mothers who test positive for drugs. And whereas in other countries that have more, harsher traditions of criminal justice, we might see more use of the death penalty or use of, coercive drug treatment. But the important thing to me, is that in a human rights context, the framework of risk that's created is created by the laws themselves, and the idea that we can punish our way out of, drug use, drug markets, drug trafficking. And once you kind of create that framework of risk, human rights risk, you can see it take off into really extreme and horrific ways, as we see in the Philippines right now. But keep in mind, just south of you in the U.S., the presidential campaign that's going on there, you have on the one hand Donald Trump, someone who openly admires President Duterte, and in many ways you could see, I think, his approach to governing and his approach to the media and his approach, to the law and order is very similar to Duterte's. And Trump, campaigned on the border wall, with Mexico, which was all about demonizing Mexico as the source of drugs into the U.S. He's, spoken positively about the death penalty for drugs. So he's running on the one hand against Joe Biden, who in the 80s and 90s, Joe Biden was one of the senators who was the architects of the drug laws in the U.S. that have resulted in mass incarceration, and particularly mass incarceration of African Americans. So, and Biden's the progressive candidate on drugs in the U.S., So you say it takes different forms in different countries, but it's all premised on this idea that we can punish our way, that punishment is somehow an appropriate response to drugs.
Mm. And can I ask you, Raffy, how have the policies been received in the Philippines? I mean, we saw in the film, obviously it's a short film, but we saw this protest from journalists. Is there much protest against the policies?
Well, it's not as big. There's been a pushback, but it's not only with the drug war and the extrajudicial killings, but of the shrinking space of the democracy. I mean, even well, we've seen like some of the media institutions being who are critical with the president, with this administration being um, penalized in some way. Rappler, then you have the biggest TV station whose franchise was canceled. Even the newspaper I used to work with uh, was critical with the president, and it was also well, the president was attacking the newspaper too, and it sends out this chilling effect to media, journalists. Uh, a senator was critical with the president, was jailed, and it's all of these factors. It's not only with the drug war, but there's been a pushback. I think people are now, despite what's happening here, people are speaking out. Duterte is still very much popular, but I think opinions are changing. Even with the drug war, I remember during the start, um, people were for the drug war and for the killings. But after months, with all the attention, media attention, international attention with the drug war and the extrajudicial killings, these opinions changed too. They still support the drug war, but they are now questioning the methods. They would rather see people getting arrested than being killed. I think that's one way. I mean, it's still a long way to go, but I think we've gained also positive things in along the way.
Mm-hmm. Can I just follow up on that with you, Raffy? How do you deal with this political context? I mean, I imagine it came out in the film a little bit, but I imagine there must be political pressures against reporting on this issue or against reporting negatively on this issue.
Well, the attacks are much online. I'm not really very savvy on online. I don't really pay much attention to it. I don't even have Facebook, to be honest. So I just continue the work. I try not to read, comment, bother myself to because the attacks are only online. That's on my part, but I cannot say it's with the rest of the journalists. We just continue our work, documenting, and basically just telling people that there are other ways of solving this, and it's we're just humanizing these people. They're not just drug users. They're not just drug pushers. They are people, and basically humanize them. And I don't think what we're doing is wrong. We're not doing anything wrong. We're just doing our work, and just continue.
Mm-hmm. Rick, can I ask you, how did you become involved in this work? I know you've been doing it for a very long time, working on this issue of drugs and human rights, and what drew you to it?
Well, I mean, my background into it, I suppose, was through the HIV movement. I sort of started my career in the early 90s in Toronto, working for a community organization. We went into prisons to do work and support for prisoners who were living with HIV. And most of those men and women were drug users. So I had to sort of educate myself very quickly and become familiar with, issues around drug use and drug policy. And of course, when you're in prison, that instinctively starts to intersect with questions of policy and human rights. And so I guess I know we're primarily a human rights audience here. I mean, so my kind of, from a human rights advocacy perspective or research, my entry point was the right to health and working on harm reduction issues and trying to create a human rights law basis around harm reduction using the right to health as a tool, Article 12 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And as part of that, I guess that was sort of interested in me. And then my segue from that was I started doing work on the death penalty for drug offenses. And again, that was sort of a strategic move, because when we started doing our work on human rights and drug policy, say around 2007, it didn't exist really as an area of human rights scholarship or policy, really. I mean, human rights people didn't talk about drugs, and drugs people didn't talk about human rights. And so it was very difficult to even begin to discuss that. And so the death penalty work became an entry point, because obviously the death penalty is one of the major human rights issues around the world. So focusing that on looking at the death penalty for drugs and the fact that most executions around the world take place for drug offenses became an entry point to start introducing the idea that drug policy actually does have a human rights impact. And then from there, we could start talking more broadly about issues around the right to health. And I think, I mean, it's sort of a horrible circumstance, but I think one of the things the situation in the Philippines has done, and particularly the photos that Raffy and his colleagues have done, is highlighted around the world the fact that drug policy is a human rights issue. And I can see when you were talking, Raffy, about the pressure that journalists have come under, I can particularly see why the photographers have, because so many of our societies, are moving away from reading anything longer than a tweet, so we can have wonderful, and we do, like wonderful in-depth reporting in a research sense, but there's nothing like a photograph to capture the humanity and the brutality of what's going on. And that transcends culture, it transcends language, and it goes around the world as an instant snapshot, and everyone can connect with that. And so that kind of work that you've been doing have just given such, kind of power and, emotional, I guess, weight, to illustrating what's going on. And that's, I said it's a horrible thing, but it really has opened up, I think, people's eyes to issues around drugs and human rights generally.
Can I ask you, Raffy, just on this, kind of drawing on this subject, I mean, I imagine going to crime scenes and viewing these quite disturbing scenes can also be upsetting. But how do you deal with that aspect of things, of the kind of trauma that could be involved in viewing all these things?
Well, I can't say I'm used to it by now. No. Actually, a few days ago, I covered another burial of a teenager. He was 15 back in 2016 when he was arrested during one of these raids in a community, and he was one of those rounded up. He was 15 then. He was arrested and charged for possession of illegal drugs, and he stayed in a facility for 3 years. And he just came out in 2019, and a year later he was killed by a still unidentified motorcycle riding gunman. And crime scenes are different. Sometimes really it's just a dead body. If there's no name, and it's just, but once there's family and there's connection there, and you get all these connections, who this person was, and you relate to it. And that's I know covering this, it takes a toll. I remember in the first few months it was very heavy, and I have to say some of us were suffering from some already some PTSD. Some of my colleagues did, and to me, I didn't want it to be normal, so we had to take it to another level. Even though it's not work, we go to the wakes, we go to the funerals, and trying to get details on who this person was, even getting their names right. I think that's very important, getting their names right, because sometimes in these crime scenes, when we go there, sometimes they're just aliases. He's this, he's that, drug user, fought back, is dead. But once you talk to the families, then you you how do I say this? Try to build who used to be this person, and from there you connect, and so there it's quite heavy, but can we do? We just have to continue, and it's also good to take breaks.
Yeah.
It's good to take breaks. Sometimes you really have to detach yourself, and lastly, I think the best therapy for me was talking about it. That's why I agreed to all these talks. Honestly, if I just kept it to myself, seeing all this, what I've known, what I know, and from all the stories I've been hearing, I think I'll get crazy.
Yeah.
I think that's what I think.
I mean, I think it's something that a lot of people who do human rights work, not just human rights work, but that's of course what I'm thinking of, because that's what I do. But even myself, I mean, just talking to victims of, I work mostly on genocide and mostly interviewing people, so interviewing victims and perpetrators of genocide. But I also fear, I think what you fear, that I actually fear that it becomes too easy, in a sense, that it becomes too normal, because you do become used to it. And I wonder if, or I worry perhaps, that something is lost, you know, if you become used to such appalling things. I guess that's more of a comment than a question. But I mean, Rick, I'm sure that even yourself, I mean, you're maybe less in the policy realm, but obviously working directly on human rights issues can sometimes be difficult as well.
Sure. I mean, and that's, I mean, just personally for me, as I worked in HIV services for the first 7 years of my career. And I was sort of I started in the early 90s, and that was back before we had good treatments available for HIV. So it was working in a job that you were surrounded by people sick and dying, your clients, your coworkers. And I remember at the time, this was back in Toronto, people used to say if you worked 5 years in HIV, you were a long timer, because, I mean, if you were living with HIV, you've survived that long. And if you were HIV negative, you'd managed to put up with that much death around you. So, I mean, that was certainly one of the things that I guess moved me out of that job eventually, was just, you know, being around and being around people that you know who are dying, and their friends, and that constant sense of loss. And yeah, I know from people, you know, who were working in the 80s on that, people in the gay community, and it was even worse. In some parts of the world, it's still that bad, you know, where the people don't have access to good medicine. So yeah, I totally understand that. And I think for people, you know, your students on the human rights course, it's something, you know, self-care in this field can be really important, particularly, you know, if you're working out in the field, whatever that might be. You don't underestimate the importance of that, and taking time for yourself. And as Raffy said, you know, finding people you're safe to talk to about it is incredibly important. So don't underestimate that, because people do get PTSD, people do burn out, people do internalize grief. And, you know, it doesn't always come out in healthy ways. So that's an important thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I could see a bit of a parallel with, you know, between journalism and with people who are working really directly on human rights issues, that you could also feel like it's all up to you, that it's all your responsibility, everything is urgent, everything is important. So I think, as both of you said, taking breaks is a key aspect in trying to gain some perspective outside of the immediate work. Now, I see we have a couple of questions from the audience, so I think I'll go to those. Maybe we'll start with Kimberly's question, just because it was first, and I guess, Raffy, you can jump in here. But has anybody been held accountable for these extrajudicial killings?
Well, only 3 police officers have been convicted out of the thousands of deaths. It's for one case. That's the killing of Kian Loy de los Santos, a teenager who got whose death caused public public uproar, and that's why I guess the government acted on it as quickly. And that's only one case out of the thousands. And well, the government saying that they're doing their job. Well, consider yourself, one case out of the thousand. I don't think so.
I mean, I find the whole scenario is interesting. This use of these vigilantes, who, I mean, of course, the government says they have no connection to, but it seems, based on your reporting and the reporting of other people and human rights organizations, that there are some government connections. I mean, even in the film, the people who are being interviewed say that they receive some training or some payment from the government as well. But I'm wondering maybe as well why these people agreed to speak to the filmmakers. I don't know if you have any insight into that. I mean, I find it interesting as well, if it's just a matter of that they're so sure about what they're doing, or are they actually sort of boasting, or is it something else?
I wasn't part of that, the interview with the vigilantes, but from some that we've interviewed, they're practically saying the same thing, that they were, some of them are being coerced to do these things. Even the term vigilante, maybe they start out as really believing in what they're doing, but many of them are gun for hire. Basically, they're doing it for the money. And some of them, well, from what we've heard, they are being coerced. Some of them are former drug users, drug pushers, being coerced to carry out the police's job, to hunt down their own, because it's easier for them to know who the people who are using drugs, who are doing the pushing.
It's interesting. I mean, I use the term vigilanteism. I see it sometimes in the literature, but I would describe it more as paramilitarism, in the sense that they're connected to the state. And that is one of the reasons why these kinds of people are used, is this plausible deniability. Then the government can say, we have no involvement in it, and it's just these people who are going off and doing their own thing for their own reasons. But as we know, that's probably not the case. I'm going to put a question to both of you now. Another question from the audience, and maybe I'll start with you, Rick, but feel free to chime in as well, Raffy. But I'll summarize. Christine, who's actually my colleague down the hall here in communications, but she's saying that many people are already tired of corruption and of the drug problem in the Philippines. Now they're also, of course, upset about what's happening in terms of all the killings. So this is a big question, but what's a better approach, or maybe what's a human rights based approach to solving this drug issue? I'll start with you, Rick.
Well, I mean, certainly, I think, first off, moving away from brutality directed at poor people, which is basically what we're looking at. I mean, we can look around the world, and there is good work going on in the Philippines. I mean, I was on a webinar on Wednesday with a researcher from the Philippines who was talking about, all the positive kind of work that's being done around harm reduction and providing services and health services for drug users. But he says so much of that is going on kind of below the surface because of the dangerous situation. He said it's very difficult to even kind of collect that information from people about what services are being provided because they're being done in secret. It's word of mouth. It's not like in Canada where you have a harm reduction service, a needle exchange or something like that. And, it's very obvious, where to go. You have a public face on it. So there is really important work being done by activists in the Philippines, both people like, Raffy documenting the killings, but also people providing services, harm reduction and health services and support services to people who use drugs, even when that is very, very dangerous to do. And yes, I think it's important to recognize that, the first step is trying to move away from this idea that people who use drugs are somehow, not part of our society, that I mean, you could hear the language that we heard in the film is language you hear in many, many countries. In North America, certainly, the idea that drugs are evil, that drugs are a plague. I mean, something I've written a lot about, which may be interesting to the human rights students, is sometime you should have a look at the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which is the very first United Nations treaty on drugs, which in the preamble to the treaty describes addiction to drugs as evil and says that states have a duty to prevent and combat that evil. And I wrote an article years ago trying to look at other international conventions, and because evil's not really a word you typically associate with legal texts. So, I mean, you could go through things like the Genocide Convention or the Apartheid Convention or the Torture Convention or the Slavery Convention. None of those documents use the word evil to describe genocide, torture, apartheid. But in international law, drug addiction is evil. So from the very foundation of how we conceptualize it, it's about, creating a population of people as being a threat, essentially. And the whole approach to drugs is around threat. And that's why I think I like the photos that Raffy and his colleagues have done. As I was saying, it's just so much more than, people like me. I can write articles about it, but there's nothing like actually seeing people and humanizing, and we can connect with those emotions, across cultures, across nations, across languages. So that kind of work is just so important, and I think really is what starts to break down this idea that we can just kill our way out of our social problems, is humanizing everyone.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, obviously, if you look at, I guess, Raffy, your most famous photograph maybe is the one that Duterte himself was describing as being like the Virgin Mary. Obviously, a very powerful image, but if you look at an image like that, it doesn't look like a picture of evil. But what do you? I'm wondering what your opinion on this is, Raffy. And I know you're not a policymaker, but how can we better address the drug issue in the Philippines?
Like from this question, what's a better approach? What can human rights work? I think it's not an easy problem to solve, really. It took years of vilification of people who use drugs, years and years of vilification. In the Philippines, once there's a heinous crime or one controversial crime that happens, you always blame the drug addict. You always do. Because they're the easy targets, easy people to put blame on, and it's this. I mean, years of this. It's in the Filipino psyche, not only in the Philippines, but I guess all over the world, that they see drugs as something evil. Like myself, when this was happening, I just knew that we needed to solve the drug issue, but I will be never for the killings. There must be better ways of doing this. Later on, I actively participated. I educated myself on other methods, human rights solutions to the drug issue. Even knowing about addiction, about drugs, and it helps. It's ignorance. It's really ignorance. And we fear, basically, we fear what we do not know. But the more you learn about it, that addiction, that drugs is a health problem, then you become to understand things and find or advocate for these solutions. And in the Philippines, they just know the Duterte solution. Then that's what we're trying to do, trying to educate them too, that there are other solutions actually. And this was years and years of this. No one was really paying much attention to it. Let's face it, even in the human rights community in the Philippines, when people were starting getting killed, that's when people started tackling the drug issue in the Philippines. And Duterte was the perfect storm. He unleashed this to the country. It's a long road way to go. But I think the simple conversations at home really helps. In the Philippines too, it's taboo even to speak about drugs or families who are using drugs, who are addicts in their own homes. These are uncomfortable conversations at home that we must begin to talk about it, to understand things. And I think we've gained so much ground too, despite what's happened. I think we've gained so much ground too. That, yeah, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, and I there's another question from the audience. Actually, one of my students, Paula, at least I think it's my student, is asking, are the protests having any effect? Are the protests increasing over time? Is resistance to the drug policy increasing, if you can call it drug policy?
Well, it's growing. I can say it's growing. Well, maybe not enough, but it is growing. There are many factors too. Divisions among many of groups and stuff like that. But it is growing. I think people are getting more aware of what's happening. It's not just people are questioning, even those who supported the drug campaign that start. They're beginning to change their minds, opinions. Yeah, and it will continue to grow. I that's for sure.
Yeah. Let me ask you. I'll ask you another question, actually, from the audience again. And this is another one of my students who actually wrote a paper on, I know, on the Philippines. I think specifically this issue of crimes against humanity, whether the ICC could have any role in this. But her question is different.
Yep.
Her question. Let me see. Oh, actually, her question is related to the ICC. Has anything changed in regards to Duterte and the way he governs the country, with the Philippines officially leaving the ICC last year and during this time of COVID-19? Maybe I'll slightly reframe that question also, so both of you can jump in if you want. But has the ICC thing had any impact, positive or negative, on the situation? And also, has COVID had any impact on the situation? Or what role can the ICC play in this more broadly? I know, Rick, you're less of an expert specifically on the Philippines, but maybe I'll put it to you first, but does international criminal justice have any role in this or any positive effect?
Yeah, I mean, obviously with my international human rights hat on, I think it's tremendously important. But also recognizing from a domestic perspective, and I say, Raffy, you can certainly correct me on this because it's an outside perspective, but it seems to me that because Duterte is sort of a populist, nationalist politician, I get the sense he's quite happy to be able to set himself up in opposition to an international court, to have to say he would, defending, as Donald Trump does as well, with the same types of rhetoric, having a foreign enemy trying to come in and tell people in the Philippines what to do and tell the government of the Philippines what to do. Well, that kind of plays to some of his rhetorical strengths, again, in the same way that it does, when Trump takes on the UN or something like that. Or even, here in the UK, when the Special Rapporteur on Poverty was critical of the UK, it allowed the Conservative government here to sort of, beat their chest and say, we won't listen to these liberal do-gooders from Geneva come and tell us what to do. That's sort of my sense anyway. So it's difficult. I think the processes are incredibly important, but they also can be played by talented politicians to their own strength in their hand, I think.
Yeah. What's your view, Raffy?
Well, that's true. I mean, his rhetoric was consistent throughout, but when COVID struck the world, I don't know, things. You've seen him. It was his first time to appear in the UN summit, and he used to curse it. But I don't know. Maybe things are changing. We maybe need the help of everyone now. I don't know. Let's see in the future. But I think COVID might have changed some things. He's still saying that the policy is still the same. But let's see in the coming months.
Yeah, I'm wondering that, and this is for both of you. And Rick, you brought it up, 20 minutes ago or something. But the American election. I'm not going to ask for your views on Donald Trump, but Duterte is actually often compared to Donald Trump in the sense that they're both populist politicians. But I wonder, would the American election result potentially have any effect on policy towards Duterte, American policy towards Duterte?
I would certainly say yes. I mean, I think if Biden gets elected, certainly you won't have the mutual admiration society that you have between Trump and Duterte. Again, who are very similar characters in a lot of ways in terms of their presentation and their politics. But I mean, again, what impact that has domestically in the Philippines, I mean, I don't know. But I certainly think you're not going to have, you wouldn't have a President Biden reveling in his relationship with Duterte. But then again, I don't know whether President Biden would go out on a limb and, there's real politics involved in international relations and, reluctance of states to criticize each other. So, I mean, I don't know, Raffy. I don't know what the relationship or the influences of the U.S. Today on the Philippines anyway.
Well, it's like a tug of war. Relations with the U.S. and China, and if Trump loses, well, things will definitely change. I'm sure Biden will criticize the president for his human rights record. I hope he does. But it's also with the territory. I mean, the with the West Philippine Sea and all this comes into play. But we're seeing like a tug of war happening now.
Yeah, obviously the Philippines has a close relationship to the United States, or historically as well. I mean, but
Before,
before, now it's and I'm also not an expert, but now it is definitely changing, and these things evolve over time. But that was the relationship in the past, at least. I mean, the U.S., the Philippines used to be an American territory, obviously at one point. But I have another question. This one is posed specifically to you, Raffy. You mentioned the film in the beginning that you were trying to capture moments that moved people, but then it turned into defiance. Can you state if there was anything in particular that caused that change?
well, after several months of doing this kind of work, it was also my decision. It's also my choice to stay and just continue documenting it, because I know it's important to document this very sad history in the country. And it's also because when you have majority of Filipinos agreeing to what's happening, and I cannot accept that. I cannot accept that. So that's why, well, in my own way, I'm using this images to educate people. It has become an advocacy, and trying to educate people on human rights, looking for better solutions to solve the drug issue. and using also these images as forms of defiance. People have used it and it's there. It's out there for people to use in protest of what's happening. We just cannot accept it, despite majority of Filipinos approving.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously journalism can definitely be human rights work. I mean, whether journalists frame it that way or not, I'm not sure. But
Yes.
I was speaking years ago to Roy Gutman, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the Bosnian Wars of the 1990s. And he said that he was very deliberate in what he chose to report on, and actually sometimes what he chose not to report on, because he was really actually engaging in advocacy, in the sense that he wanted people to pay attention to this issue, which was war crimes and even genocide happening in Bosnia at the time. So there was a mission behind it, I suppose, that had a human rights lens as well. Let me ask you a big question.
Yeah, for
Rick.
many of us.
Yeah. Yeah, well, actually, maybe before I get to the question I was going to ask Rick, let me ask you as well, Raffy, if you work, how do you actually locate crime scenes? And more broadly, are you also working with people who are in NGOs and things like that, civil society, or is that kind of a separate sphere from what you do?
During the start, we used to we work with journalists basically. That's why they called us Nightcrawlers. We're not an official group. We're never official group. We come from different media organizations, and basically when we were covering during the start of the killings, the drug war, we built this like a chat group where we send information for tips. It's varied. Basically some of the tips were coming in even from the police during the start. Police will tip us where these bodies are. Then we try to go to look for other sources too. When media attention was already international about the killings and all this pressure coming in, police would not tip us anymore where these crime scenes were. So we had to find other ways, like getting information from funeral workers, even on social media, people who see crime scenes or witness crime scenes in the streets. And we just had to that, and we built our network from that. Then later on, we collaborated. Our networks grew bigger and connected to the NGOs, and basically we're the first ones to find where these crime scenes are. Then from these reports, CSOs or NGOs will come in after, and later on it developed. When we hear of families looking for assistance, like burial services, because they cannot even pay for the funeral. It costs almost $1,000 for one funeral, and these are poor families. And sometimes it lasts for more than a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So we connect these families to those people who could help. Sometimes from our posts alone, from social media, people will message us how can they help. So there's also this church, the Baclaran Church, who have a funeral assistance program. So we connect them to them so they can help. Even with looking for lawyers, if they're seeking for any assistance there, so we connect them to the lawyers too. So it grew from that.
That's interesting. Maybe I'll ask you a really big picture question, Rick. Just of what do we see in terms of this human rights connection to drug policy? Is it something that's improving over the years? Are people recognizing more these harm reduction approaches? What is the big picture, or is it more like one step forward, two back?
Well, I mean, we're sort of at an interesting historical moment where I mean, for many, many decades, there was a real kind of, at least publicly, a united approach to drugs, even though privately countries, there was a lot of flexibility in what different countries did. But sort of publicly, from the kind of UN consensus documents that they produce, they would always sort of say we have a unified position. But that's really starting to break apart and go into different ways. On the one hand, you have countries, I mean, Canada is a good example of this. Canada legalized cannabis nationally. We just had a referendum on that in New Zealand, which looks like it's lost, but still, it was pretty close. 47, 48% of the population voted in favor of legalizing cannabis. Again, we have more states in the U.S. next week are having referenda on legalizing cannabis. We have more states more and more countries decriminalizing personal possession of all drugs. So on the one hand, you kind of have those positive moves moving away from a criminalized approach. But on the other hand, you have an increasing number of kind of populist political leaders who are really doubling down on the drug war thing. I mean, Duterte is obviously major figure in that, but Trump is part of that. Bolsonaro in Brazil is part of that. Orban in Hungary is part of that. Jokowi in Indonesia revived the death penalty for drugs. We have, and there's other countries in the region as well where, politicians have been quite happy to, again, use the drug control, the war on drugs thing as part of their political message and their political identity. So, on the one hand, we see some countries moving to, more liberalized, more health-based, less criminalized environments. And on the other hand, we have countries and political leaders in those countries that are really instrumentalizing the war on drugs as a way to solidify control, generate a popular political message around them, make them the strongman figure, and use kind of drugs as, again, the evil, the external evil that we're going to try to defend our country against. And so it is, a really interesting period in that what we see like two very distinct trends going in different ways.
Yeah, I guess, there is this kind of rise of populist movements that we see at the same time. And as you said, it's an easy scapegoat to go after the drug users, especially where there's this kind of moralizing around drugs. The drug users become evil in using drugs.
Well, I think the film talks a bit about this as well, and Raffy's talked about it already. It's like, drug problems in countries are complex problems. Most people who use drugs don't have any problems related to drugs. I mean, the figures from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime estimate that 90% of drug use is what they call non-problematic. So there's no health problems, there's no employment problems, there's no engagement with the criminal justice system, but you have sort of 1 in 10 people who use drugs in what they describe as a problematic way. And generally, that population of people tends to reflect other social vulnerabilities in terms of being, racially marginalized, impoverished, perhaps being immigrant or migrant populations. They have other vulnerabilities, young people, people who are otherwise criminalized. And so, to sort of, if you see the drug problem in quotation marks as being reflected in that 10% of people who use drugs, those are people who have complex needs. Those are complex individuals, complex families, and helping those people takes a complex response. That's not just a criminal justice response. It's a health response. It's a social welfare response. It's an anti-racist and anti-oppression response. And governments don't tend to like those, right? Governments like easy answers for complex questions. And just, knocking people around or arresting them or locking them up for 20 years at a time or executing them or killing them. I mean, those are easy answers that you can explain in a soundbite as a political candidate. Whereas trying to solve, more entrenched, deeper systemic problems of poverty, unemployment, marginalization, it's much more difficult, and a much less attractive mission for most governments.
Nuance doesn't make for great sound bites. Saying we have to think about this and we have to think about that. It's not nearly as punchy as giving the easy solution, as you said. We did have a couple of questions come in, and I know I don't want to keep you too much longer, maybe especially Raffy, just given the time difference. But so Jennifer asks, in your work, have you been a target of, as someone who's attempting to raise the moral conscience of Filipinos, how do you deal with the haters of those who believe that this work is a social disturbance or that you're a negative thinker?
Well, I remember in one scene there in one scene there were some Filipinos who were attacking me during one of the talks. It's basically that I'm just laying out. They were saying that you're negative to the country. Well, we have to stop the bleeding first. Of course, the Philippines not all that bad, but there are people getting killed. And how can I talk about the good things when people are getting killed? Let's stop the bleeding first, and let's look at the real problems. It's more than 4 years already of the drug war. Drugs hasn't stopped. Supply and demand, it's still very high. It's still very cheap in the streets. So basically, it didn't work. The president promised to solve the drug problem in 6 months. And no, it's still happening. And what we have are thousands of people who were killed. Did it solve anything? No. So you have to look at other methods now. Look at the roots of the drugs of addiction. And like what Rick said, let's go deeper. Let's look at the roots, which is poverty, lack of job opportunities, lack of education. And so many of these factors that government must address first.
Maybe I'll have one more question from the audience, which I see on the screen there, and then I'll ask you one more question myself, and then I think that'll be it. For me, it's been a really fascinating discussion so far. So Nora, who's also one of my students are here in numbers, which is great, is asking, what challenges or dilemmas has the drug war posed for community leaders in the Philippines?
Well, it has created that climate of fear in the Philippines, especially the leaders, especially in the barangay level. If they do not cooperate, there's national government will think that they are supporters or drug users too, drug pushers even. And that's the thing. And unfortunately, some of them get killed too. Local barangay leaders. So there's that fear with them in speaking out, and they will also be vilified.
Maybe I could reframe the question slightly for you, Rick, as well. How can politicians speak about drug issues? Generally speaking, I mean, given this fact that, as we said, that drug use and drug users can be vilified and that nuance isn't always welcome, but how do they talk about drug issues? How can they talk about drug issues in a way that engages the public meaningfully?
Well, I mean, sometimes I think, the best way politicians could talk about drug issues is to not talk about them as drug issues. Because you tend to have, again, you want simplistic answers to complex questions. So the easiest thing to do is to blame things on drugs. And again, to go back to sort of the start of my presentation, when I was doing work in Toronto and going into prisons, supporting prisoners who are living with HIV, again, they were all drug users. And, you know, I'm sure the courts looked at them as drug users and the police looked at them as drug users. But, like, you know, and they were drug users, but drug use wasn't their problem, you know? Their problems were that they had been abused in their families. They were survivors of residential schools. You know, they grown up in poverty. You know, some of them had, you know, sort of mental health or other emotional problems. It's like the drugs weren't the problem. You could take the drugs away from them, and they were still going to struggle with all the things that they were struggling with in terms of their lives. So, you know, I think for me, the way politicians talk about drugs is not to talk about it as a drug problem. You know, there are obviously social and health problems related to drugs, crime problems that emerge from drug markets. But, you know, we need to define the problems not as the drug itself or the drug markets. What is it that causes that to be the case? And so I think you can talk, you know, in positive ways. And again, we've seen that Canada's had some good examples of that, the way that that's been done in Vancouver, for example, around the drug, you know, safe injection site of Insight and the, you know, the public mobilization that was done to try to, you know, talk about why we need these kinds of services for really vulnerable people who use drugs, homeless people who use drugs, you know, and why that's a good thing, why it's a much better and more productive thing than just pointing at people and telling them to stop using drugs. You know, that we can actually put these fairly simple things in place that, you know, have the immediate effect of validating people's dignity. And this is, I mean, I've talked a lot about human dignity in my work, because I think when you talk to a lot of people who use drugs who are marginalized or criminalized, you know, their dignity is just stripped away from them because they're seen as kind of, you know, dirty drug users, evil drug users. And, you know, somehow, like, and I saw this in my own work doing harm reduction services, like just accepting people for who they are and come in, have a cup of coffee, you know, what you need. Do you need some, you know, do you need to see a nurse? You know, what can I help you with? Do you need some financial support? Do you need clean syringes? You know, do you just need to sleep in a safe place for an afternoon? You know, those things that just validate people's humanity and make, you know, just so important and so critical. So I think there are real things that politicians can talk about in those terms, that, like Raffy's photos, are just common human emotions and human experiences. So I think you can take these things and put them in a positive way about building community and supporting each other in social solidarity. But I say it takes very kind of articulate, thoughtful, emotive political leaders to build that kind of consensus.
Yeah, that's a great note to end things on. But I'm going to ask one more question to both of you. Just a very broad question, but I mean, you're both doing remarkable work, albeit from quite different angles. But what can we do, if anything, to help you with your work or to address the situation in the Philippines?
Well,
Raffy?
one, if you look at my website, it's just raffylerma.com. There's a call to action there in how to help some of these groups who've been these are groups that handles the victims' families. One is the Paghilom, that means healing. They offer their program to the families of those who were killed. And there's also Rise Up. These are also victims' families who are, well, seeking accountability too. So there are groups doing their own work. There's also So. It's a group of mothers too in the Quezon City area. And I mean, it took some time, but there are now groups helping out and doing incredible work. That, well, at the first year, there wasn't really, I guess people were overwhelmed what's happening and didn't know what to do. And yeah, support these groups, help them.
Great. And Rick?
well, I obviously can't speak to the situation in the Philippines in that sense, but I guess just for the students who are on here, the people who are doing human rights master's degrees, or I know some of my students are here as well from Swansea watching, doing masters in criminology or in human rights. I mean, my mission over the last 15 years, I suppose, is, to try to mainstream drugs as an issue across human rights. So, I mean, I wouldn't really ask people to go out and kind of do what I do, spend all of your time thinking about drugs and human rights. But what we've always said is that whatever human rights issue you're interested in, there's probably a way that drug laws or drug policy intersects with that issue. And when we used to do guest lectures, my colleague Damon Barrett and I used to do guest lectures at different master's programs. That was always our icebreaker exercise. We'd go around the room and we'd have people call out specific human rights from treaties and challenge us to see if we could find an example of a drug law or a drug situation in one country or another that didn't have an impact intersect with that. And so that, to me, is, I guess, to all of the students there, is just when you're thinking and when you go off into your studies and into your careers, whether you're in human rights or the NGO sector or civil service or whatever you might be doing, just, every time you run across a drug issue, just try to think that it's not necessarily a crime issue, right? Try to think it's like, oh, maybe there's a human rights issue involved here, whether it's around, again, housing or women's rights, children's rights, indigenous rights, anti-racism, prisons, health, education, anything you can talk of there. You can almost always find a situation where bad drug policy has an impact on that. So I guess for me, think about that, and for your own particular areas of human rights that you might be interested in. And you might find that there's some really interesting work to be done there that no one's done before. And so if you're looking for interesting things to do research on, or to write essays on, or to write articles on, it's just a really ripe area it's still very new as a kind of an area of human rights scholarship, I suppose, or human rights advocacy. So again, that's what I would think. If you take away from today, think about that, how it might apply to your other work as you go forward.
Well, thank you both so much for your insights and sharing your personal experiences with us as well. I mean, I think it was really interesting, as I said a moment ago. It's as Rick was just saying, I mean, I think the whole issue is ripe, and I think it's fascinating. And what's happening in the Philippines is obviously so out of line, just in terms of the brutality that's being used in the whole approach. So I think whatever we can do to raise awareness of that is great. And I appreciate so much your work, and Raffy as well. I'm sure you're taking some personal risks in your work, even though you choose not to focus on that aspect. But we're all pulling for you, obviously, and hoping that you're able to continue to do your work as you've done so well so far.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Raffy, again.
Thanks,
and
thanks,
thank you,
Raffy.
Rick.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. And thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for all the questions. It's fantastic. Really good session.
Yeah. Salamat. Salamat.
And I miss you all in Canada.
Yes, you're a Canadian, I know.
Salamat.
Bye.
Bye.